Thanks for tuning in to Wine Blast. Did you know that Wine Blast Plus now comes with exclusive discount benefits? Enjoy money off Jancis Robinson glassware, Coravin and Academy du Vin library. Sign up at wineblast.co.uk, where you'll also get early access to all episodes, plus our full archive, and enjoy exclusive subscriber-only content. Hello and welcome to Wine Blast. Now, as you know, we love telling stories on this podcast, all kinds of stories. But we've got one now that is truly something else. A tale with darkness as well as light, definitely a fair amount of intrigue and mystery and suspense, not to mention lashings of fine wine.
Yeah, it's not every wine story that comes with a side helping of guns and cash and enforcers and heart-rending breakages, plus the odd death threat. And as you say, unicorn wines aplenty. Plus a fair few laughs along the way too. But this one does. Here's a brief taster.
I said, "Is that gun loaded?" And he looked at me. I thought, man, that was a dumb question. So it's a 100-year-old bottle of the great Sauterne, Suderot. And this was a crucial moment because if this wine wasn't superb, it were on the first plane out of there.
John Baker there, author of Stalin's Wine Cellar, a book we gave a very brief plug to back in season 5 in our 6 best wine books episode, but one which when we reread it, we knew we just had to bring to life on the pod because it's such a good story, isn't it?
Yeah, and John was a great sport. So this is going to work in a similar way to our Billionaire's Vinegar episodes. It's a two-parter narrative format, essentially telling the story of the book, but with extra juicy details and context, plus a bit of an update at the end. Both parts are available from the outset for our Wine Blast Plus subscribers. If you're not a subscriber, you'll have to wait for the second part to go on free release in our normal schedule.
So our advice would of course be to sign up now via wineblast.co.uk and enjoy immediate access to this two-parter as well as a whole range of subscriber benefits. But coming back to John, he's from Sydney and he was a hotelier and rock and roll promoter in the 80s era of Midnight Oil, In Excess and Men at Work. But he got bored of coming home at 4 a.m, smelling somewhere between a cigarette factory and a brewery. So he got into wine.
A natural progression if ever there was one.
Of course.
In excess to wine, there we go. Anyway, John John became a wine merchant with a number of stores in and around Sydney, as well as a Bordeaux importing business. And that's where we find him as the book opens. It's the late 1990s, and John's main store was in Double Bay, an affluent area of Sydney. By then, he'd become known for doing things a bit differently from the norm, putting on unusual tastings and dinners, and also specialising in fine and rare wine.
Now, just before we dive into this story, a few notes. Yquem, or Chateau d'Yquem, is the most famous, expensive and venerated Sauterne sweet wine from Bordeaux, which ages magnificently. It's a wine, actually, we featured before, and it's even got a mention, I think, didn't it, in our latest episode with Greg Lambrecht.
Yeah, some old vintages,
Suderot and Riesec are also highly regarded historic Sauterne estates. Chateau Lafite is a Pauillac first growth that is one of the longest-lived dry reds out there, while Penfolds Grange is perhaps Australia's most iconic dry red, historically speaking.
Now, I don't want to give too many spoilers or equally teach my granny to suck eggs, but this story does involve Georgia, the historic nation that sits at the eastern edge of the Black Sea, bordered by Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan and Russia. Its capital is Tbilisi, and the grapevine is thought to have been first domesticated for human purposes in this wider South Caucasus area. In other words, this is pretty much ground zero for wine. So it's important and historic for many reasons. Georgia also enjoys, let's say, a complicated historic relationship with its vastly larger northern neighbour, Russia.
Finally, when John talks about fluoros, he means bright fluorescent lights. He does also occasionally drum his fingers while he's telling the story, in case you're wondering what that sound is. What's more, he's prone to what we might charitably call significant understatement. He's quite dry and not one to go in for flights of fancy, is he? But that's quite endearing, isn't it?
Yeah. And also he's very good at seeing the funny, lighter side of things too. So I started by asking John about his dabblings in fine and rare wine.
Yeah, well, this was in a affluent part of the eastern suburbs of Sydney, which is the area between the city and Bondi Beach, shall we say, along the harbour. And I believe you have to have a point of difference, otherwise you're just another corner store. And our point of difference was old and rare wines, and that's in the early days we used to buy a lot at auction and anywhere we could get them. And then, but it became a self-generating business. The more of you dealt with these sort of wines, the more people would come in and offer you their cellars. So we ended up with quite a good system of people would come and offer us their cellars or various bottles of wine and whatever. Some we'd take, some we wouldn't. And it just generated itself, really. And we had one particular character who we talk about in the book called Harry Zucker, who used to come and bring us what he'd call opportunities or deals or whatever. And some were absurd, like they're figments of his imagination, and some weren't. Some were quite interesting. And I think early in the book we deal with one we bought in one of the suburbs of Sydney and brought it back to the store, and we'd have a invitation-only tasting on the Thursday night for our better customers. And they'd come in and they'd have first opportunity to buy these wines, and then we'd have them over the weekend, and they'd almost all sell out by the end of the weekend. So it was quite a lucrative part of our business.
So you've mentioned Harry there. Let's go into detail. And could you just go into a little bit of detail about one particular cellar you mentioned in the book, probably as a way of setting the context, the Terry Hills cellar.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about that particular cellar, maybe some of the wines involved there and just the process of selling that, just so we get a picture of it?
Sure. This was a cellar owned by a chap who I think had a large cleaning business, and he'd moved back to Europe and wanted to sell all the wines. And I can't remember, I think it was $120,000. This was in the 90s, so it was still quite a bit of money. And, of course, he wanted cash. Everybody wanted cash. So I had to come up with $120,000 in cash. But anyway, you could do that. So we'd inspect the cellar and satisfy ourselves that what was in it was good and valuable and in good condition particularly. And he had a list of the wines, and we'd negotiate a price on the list, and there'd always be what we call unders and overs. There might be one more bottle of one and one less of another, and we'd just do that calculation in the settling up process. And we would pack it all up and take it back to the store. And I think in this and Penfolds Grange, which is probably iconic Australian wine, so there's 2 full sets of Grange, which I think went from 1951 to about 1990, I think. And then there was another, I think, 2 6-packs of 1955 Grange, which was considered, I think, the best vintage of the 50s. I think there's 5 or 6 cases of 1966 Lafite Rothschild, which was surprising. And surprisingly, when we tasted it, it was a little disappointing. But that happens. And I think I remember there's some Riesec in there. Yeah, it was certainly interesting. And our customers, in one stage, 2 gentlemen were squabbling over a case of Riesec. It was the last case. I said, gentlemen, how about we have half each? And they, remembering themselves, went, of course.
But didn't you have a little accident with a certain bottle of Grange?
Oh, yeah, that was another one of our accidents. Yeah, when we're packing them into boxes, one should be very careful, and I was sort of maybe not as careful as some of my staff, and I pulled the top off for 1954 Grange, which was one of the bottles of one of the 2 sets. So suddenly we had one set without a 54 Grange. And that really was a bit of a problem because you couldn't buy a 54 Grange. I don't know how you'd buy one.
And how exactly did you break it?
Instead of picking it up by the body, I picked it up by the neck and basically just pulled the neck off. Because, these are old bottles. Who knows what the quality of the glass was. And I just pulled the neck off the top of the bottle.
And I was going to say, so some of these old bottles, they can be pretty fragile, can't they?
Sure, yeah, they can.
Yeah. And how expensive was that particular mistake?
Well, I think I deducted $2,000 from the full set. I think I sold the full set for $25,000, which is ridiculously cheap today. And I think I deducted $2,000 for the bottle that I'd broken, or bottle that was missing.
Okay. So we're talking, just to set the time period, we're talking sort of late 90s here, aren't we? We're talking sort of 1998, 1999.
Correct.
Seems like a different world now, doesn't it?
Sure does, yeah.
And I'm just wondering could you possibly introduce Kevin, who's also a key protagonist in the book?
Yeah, Kevin's quite a character. Great sense of humour, quite dry. Although he was my general manager at the store, Kevin very much runs his own race. And sometimes I didn't know what he was up to. But Kevin was sharp. Kevin was smart. Had a sharp brain for wine and value. And he used to trade, and still does, I think, even to today, wine all around the world. He'll buy wine in Hong Kong and sell it in London or something. And, he just plays that game and enjoys it. So, yeah, so he was valuable. And when we look at cellars, invariably Harry Zucker, this one chap who would bring us cellars, or other ones, they'd bring them to me, and I'd basically just give it to Kevin and say, Kevin, is this, what's this cellar worth? And Kevin was quite good at doing the numbers. And you never knew exactly what you could sell these wines for, a vintage, but you work it out. And all I was interested in was, we're on the right side of the numbers, and there was a profit to be had, and there'd be good wines, and we'd work all the details out later, sort of thing.
So you and Kevin were making a great team. You had this really good business with a little bit of a sideline or a focus on fine and rare wine, at which point you get another message from Harry about another potential cellar. But it was mysterious, wasn't it? Because it seemed to be in some sort of code. Talk us through that one.
Right. I was upstairs in the main office, and the fax started whirring, because this was 98, 99, and fax machines were very much a part of communication. So the fax started whirring, and which wasn't unusual. It was often going off, but it just seemed to go off continually, and there was page after page, and I thought, this is unusual. So I just looked at the top page, lifted up, and it just had interested ? And there was 30 pages, and this was from Harry Zucker, and for Harry to put just interested ? For Harry to underplay something means he probably really got something. And because otherwise he's usually coming in with all this flamboyance about the wines he's gotten. Wasn't always quite so. But this one was. So 30 pages poured off the fax machine, and Kevin was there at the time as well, which was good. And so we got the list and looked at it and tried to work out what it was, because obviously it was wine, because Harry wouldn't be contacting us with anything else. But the names down in the left-hand column weren't names that we recognised. They weren't the great wines of the world or even the great wines of Australia. But the second column had dates, 1856, 1890, 1910, etc., all the way down. I thought, well, that's interesting, but we'd never dealt with wines that old. When we'd buy a cellar in Australia, we'd be used to 1960, 1970, 1980, those sort of vintages, really. So these vintages are 100 years old, and there's some even from the century before, 1700. Almost was a bit mysterious. So we thought, well, what is this? And Kevin's my man to work this out. Kevin, I said to Kevin, so come on, you're the sharp one. What's all this? He went, not sure about this one. But knowing it's from Harry, and obviously it was a list of wines somehow, we thought, well, look, don't knock ourselves out about this, but let's just ponder it. And I'm a great believer, if you've got something that's really puzzling you, don't knock yourself out about it. Just go on with life, and don't worry if it's of interest. Your subconscious will be working in the background. It won't have forgotten it, and it'll work it out. And maybe one time when you're walking down the street or making a cup of tea, the penny will drop. And that's what happened. Where I was in that weekend when we had the big sale of the Terry Hills cellar, I was in the store, I think it was Monday or Tuesday, and a chap came in and said, "Oh, do you have any of that Chateau d'Yquem?" Or I can't remember how he pronounced it, but as you know, Chem's unusual spelling, but it's actually quite simple. But he couldn't pronounce it. And I said, "No, I'm sorry, sir. Whenever we get back vintages of Chem, it all sells out." So he left, and that was okay, and the penny dropped. And I had the list with me because I was occasionally glancing at it going, "Come on, talk to me." And when I looked at the list, there was this wine, IKEM, Ikem. And I remember when I first looked at the list, I thought, IKEA, I don't want any IKEA wines. What's this about? And then, but then I thought, hello, this list has been compiled somewhere in the world where English or French probably wasn't their language. So I thought someone somewhere has either read out these labels and someone's recorded them, and it happened to be Georgian because this all happened in Tbilisi, Georgia. And then when they wanted to sell a list, they just translated the list phonetically back to English. Hence, you had Ikem, IKEM, Chateau Margaux, as you know, spelled Margaux, and it was Margot. I think Latour, correctly Latour, was Lator, I think. And then it just went on. And when you do that phonetic translation, these become the great wines of the world. This becomes an extraordinary cellar. So I think when I was standing in the shop and this was all coming to me, I thought, wow, this is suddenly very interesting. And I rang Kevin, I think he was off that day, and he came in and I explained to him, and he ran his eye down the list and said, this is extraordinary if this is so. Because, just these were 100, 150-year-old wines. I think there's 217 bottles of a Chem from the 1800s and the early 1900s, which was exceptional, extraordinary. So,
and how many, just give us a sense of the scale. How many bottles were we talking about? What kind of price was being asked for this? Rough, how would you describe it? What was how did it strike you in that sense?
Well, they wanted $1 million US for the cellar. And I understand why, because remember, this was 1998. The Berlin Wall came down in 89. I think Georgia became a republic in 92, 93, I'm not exactly sure when. And when Russia left, of course, they left Georgia with nothing. They had no constitution, no nothing, and certainly no capital. So I think what was happening was people were trying to raise capital any way they could, particularly US dollars, because the price was $1 million in US dollars. So there's 40,000 bottles. A lot of them were old Georgian wine, but they have quite a value in themselves. Not that we're particularly interested in that, but the offer was $1 million for the 40,000 bottles.
And you saw photos, didn't you?
Early on? When I realised what the story was and what the cellar was, it was phonetic. Kevin and I went to see Harry because we wanted to know. Obviously, we wanted to know a lot more about this. And I said to Harry, Harry, the list's phonetic, isn't it? And he said, yeah, that's right. I said, okay, Harry, come on, tell us the story. Whose wines are they and where are they and all that? And he says, I'll have to get Neville to tell you. And I said, well, who's Neville? And he said, Neville has a gold mine in Tbilisi, Georgia. And his partner in Georgia is George. His name is George. I thought, yeah, of course. And he owns these properties. And when they bought these properties, I think it was the realisation of property going back to the private hands. You end up with whatever's above and whatever's below a property you buy. And I think sometimes you buy a whole block, not just a property. So they bought this, I think, a block, and part of it was this old winery called Savannah No. 1 Winery. And when they looked downstairs, there was all this amazing old wine. And so Neville had some photographs because he'd been there and he'd been in the cellar and had seen it. So I had some photographs of it, and some racks had broken, so there's a sort of glass at the bottom of the racks. And it was very wet. I could see that, and it was a lot of the bottles were covered with cobwebs and all that sort of thing. So yeah, it looked interesting.
So you were intrigued. 40,000 bottles with some amazing wine names in there. You called it in the book a potential wine gold mine. And there was one other detail, wasn't there, about the cellar that really caught your attention. Tell us a little bit about the provenance of these wines.
Yes, right. So, of course, we wanted to know whose wine was it and where it was and all the rest of it. And Neville said the story he was told by George was that this was originally the cellar of the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II. When he was coming the Russian Revolution, of course, he was taken out and dealt with, and Lenin took over. Then Lenin died a few years later, and Stalin took over. So Stalin, being the dictator that he was, everything in Russia suddenly became Stalin's, whether they liked it or not. And so, in effect, this became his cellar. And then this is Neville telling us the story. And then when with the Second World War, Stalin was very concerned that Hitler was going to overrun Russia. So he was moving artifacts out of, I guess, St. Petersburg and the Winter Palace or wherever. And there was this wine cellar. And the story we were told is it was divided into 3 parts. And one part went to the Masandra winery in the Crimea, which is a Russian national winery. And one part, and I gather it's probably the very valuable French wine, was sent to Tbilisi in Georgia, because Stalin was a Georgian. He was born just outside Tbilisi. So it was sent to Georgia to never be found. And it basically wasn't found until it came whirring off our fax machine. And so that was the story we were given. I thought, well, this is an incredible fabrication if it's not true, but it's possibly true.
If it were true, how excited did that get you?
Oh, very. Except I was very sceptical about the whole thing. It's one thing to buy cellars around Australia and work out how you're going to move them all, and in hot summer conditions and things like that. It's another thing to go on the other side of the world. But having said that, I'm a great believer that opportunities arrive in life, and people say, "Oh, you get lucky." Well, I think everybody gets lucky. It's a question of whether you take the opportunity when it comes. And I thought, okay, it's just the other side of the world. It's the same product. It's the same story. We'll work it out, as we always do.
Okay, so I think we should briefly come up for air here. John has been presented with a potential wine goldmine, a huge cellar with some of the very finest wines in the world, hundreds of years old, priceless, but also not priceless, very valuable, in fact. Not only that, these wines have a story attached that is 1 in a million. These were quite possibly wines that had been held in the hands of the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, and Joseph Stalin.
Yeah, it's like a wine lover's fever dream, isn't it? Wines aside for one moment, Nicholas II is the stuff of legend, isn't he? The last Romanov emperor, patron of Rasputin, executed by the Bolsheviks in 1918. And then Joseph Stalin, of course, who helped see off Hitler and Nazi Germany, but was also a brutal Soviet leader responsible for millions of deaths. More to the point, Stalin was originally from Georgia, which, as John points out, is of great relevance to the story.
But John, true to form, is not letting all this go to his head. He remains stoically sceptical as we take a break. To recap so far, John Baker was just an ordinary Sydney wine merchant when opportunity came knocking in the form of a mysterious wine cellar in Tbilisi, Georgia, rumoured to have once belonged to the last Tsar of Russia and Joseph Stalin himself.
Now, John remained circumspect, though admits to feeling a little bit excited. By way of background, I asked John what was the link between great French wines and Russia and Georgia.
When Peter the Great created St. Petersburg, he considered Russia was too barbaric and it needed a gentrified port on the Baltic where it could trade and communicate with Paris and Venice, I think, were the two great cities at the time, and probably, I imagine London as well. And so he created St. Petersburg out of actually some swampland that the Swedes actually owned at the time, but they were next door, and I think he invited them to leave, or if you want to stay, you could build my city for me. You could take your pick, sort of thing. So they sort of thought, well, better we get out of here. So he built St. Petersburg. Everything, and Paris, I think, was his model city. And in the nobility of St. Petersburg, you spoke French, you dressed in French clothes, you ate French food, you drank French wine, and if you didn't, you're out, sort of thing. So France became the supplier of so much to early days to St. Petersburg, artists, sculptures, and wine, of course. And the Russians, and I think most of Eastern Europe, have a very sweet palate, have a great palate for sweet things. And, of course, Akem was the ultimate sweet wine, and it delivers that incredible intensity of sweetness and richness, and it's incredibly aspirational. It is one of the great wines of France. So it became highly desirable for the court in St. Petersburg. So I'd imagine that in successive Tsars after Peter, I'd imagine they maintained that relationship, and certainly up to Nicholas II, the wines that we're looking at, they would have come through probably from Nicholas II, or I think his father was Alexander III. So obviously they must have maintained it to have these wines there.
So the Russian elites were very Francophile, so they bought a lot of French wines, particularly the sweet ones, as you said, with a sweet tooth. But tell us a bit about Tsar Nicholas II and indeed Joseph Stalin.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about Nicholas II myself. I think he wasn't a great Tsar. I think he liked to spend his time with his troops and on the battlefield and spend a lot of time drinking with them. I think he was a bit of a reluctant Tsar in some ways, from my reading. And then, and Joseph Stalin was, of course, the incredible dictator that the world came to know and fear, and his atrocities of his own people, I think, were legendary, unfortunately. So I don't know if he had much of a palate. There's no real records of his drinking. I think the last Akems in this cellar were 1910. And the date stopped not long after the Bolsheviks had taken over. So I guess they probably stopped that flow of French wines. It all sort of adds up chronologically.
But Joseph Stalin inherited the cellar, as it were, and then, as you said, it was split up, possibly because of the Nazi invasion. They wanted to secrete these wines away, and some of them ended up in Georgia.
Yeah. Correct.
But we don't know that much about Stalin's drinking habits, do we? Some people say he was a heavy drinker, but actually what it seems to be is that he used alcohol as a way of getting secrets out of his enemies. Wasn't that right?
Or out of his own people, out of his own generals and out of his own military and anyone. I think Stalin, from what I gathered, probably didn't have many friends, and therefore everyone was an enemy. And I think when you're running that sort of regime, there's going to be secrets, and there'll be alliances going on. And I imagine he wanted to know what they were, and alcohol was one of his means of getting these stories or getting this information. And I think the Russians don't mind a drink anyway. So I know when we were there, keeping up with the shots of vodka was a bit of a challenge, but.
So you had this cellar in front of you with this fax, with this promise of a wine gold mine. You were quite excited on the one hand, but you also had real reservations and doubts on the other. So what was the plan you formulated to come up with to deal with this Georgian cellar? Well,
it was pretty obvious to us right from the beginning that someone had to go and inspect it and authenticate it. I mean, there's no point really talking much more if you didn't want to do that, because what are you talking about? And And obviously the reason that Harry Zucker came to us with it was because he wanted us to go and do it. And quite rightfully, we probably were in the best position to do it. We're used to dealing with old rare wines. So we made an agreement between myself, Kevin, Harry Zucker and Neville. We each put $10,000 into a kitty, and off Kevin and I went to Tbilisi, Georgia, and to do our best. And that's how it all happened.
And what were your initial impressions of Tbilisi?
You've got to remember, I get fairly single-minded when I'm doing something like this. We're going to have to spend $1 million US. I mean, that was a lot more than I'd spent on a cellar, and I actually didn't have the $1 million, but I did have a few people in Sydney that said, "Come on, we'll finance it if you need." Anyway, so we hadn't got to that stage yet. But so we flew. I think we packed up some gear. We took one of the things that I took note of in the photographs was how dark it was, and even with these photographs that Neville had, you could see that there was a flash taken, and there was just a single bulb which was the light, which I assume was in the cellar, and I could see that everything was very wet. So we took some very good fluoros, we took some very strong torches, and some other gear, and off we went. Sydney, Singapore, London, back to Tbilisi. I think it took us 30 hours. And we arrived at 2 or 3 in the morning or something like that, just feeling terrific. And George was there to meet us, of course. And John Baker, my friend, you come to our country. He came over and shook my hand like I was the President of the United States or something. And so that was our arrival in Tbilisi. And I said to George, we need to do customs. And he said, "Oh, John, don't worry, we do customs for you." And he took us upstairs to meet some of his colleagues. And we had a plate of chocolates and a bottle of sparkling Georgian red wine, just what you want at 2 or 3 in the morning. Anyway.
And just to recap, George was your key point of contact in Georgia.
He was our point of contact, yeah. And I'd had exchanged a few emails with him before, fax and emails, I think, before we left. And we did make one arrangement with him before we left that we'll need to take 12 bottles home with us because we want to take them to the various chateaus and have them authenticated. Or he says, we talk about that. And I said, "No, George, we don't talk about it. That's the deal. Otherwise, we're not coming." He said, "Oh, okay, I worked that out." George sort of could work everything out, sort of, somehow. And so that was quite important, though, because I really did want to take the chateaus to have them authenticated.
So you wanted to take away 12 bottles from this initial trip to get them authenticated, to prove the cellar was kosher and that you could, it might be worth $1 million US.
Yeah. I mean, I can, I thought I had a pretty good idea. I mean, I've dealt with quite a lot of bottles of a chem, not that old, but I've seen a lot of old bottles, and also, in our authenticating process, we'd work out if they're genuine or not. But no matter what we thought, I want to take 12 bottles.
But that authentication process was really vital, wasn't it? That was what you were there to do. But, as well as chocolates and sparkling wine, you were also met with sort of slightly intimidating types with guns and a black Mercedes, which would then ferry you round at top speed with complete disregard to the police. Is that right? Pretty well. When we drove into town from the airport that night, or that early morning, so the other thing I said to George, we have to get our bags. He says, "Oh, no, John, we get the bags too." So we didn't see anyone. They just did it all. So I don't know how that works, but that's how it works. And we got into the black Mercedes with the tinted windows, which is sort of our staff car for a few days in a fashion. And off we drove into Georgia, about 120, 110 kilometres an hour, whatever it was. And we're cruising along through the suburbs, and there's a red light, and they just swerved to the other side of the road and went through and says, "Oh, we no stop at red lights." I thought, "Oh, that's interesting." And then we got to the hotel. Fortunately, we got a little bit of sleep. They were picking us up in the morning, and when they came to pick us up,
as they'd arrived, they'd come through the door, and there's a sort of metal detector as they came through the door, and they put their guns on the counter and come and get us. And on the way out, they get given back their guns like they're an umbrella. I mean, it's just no big deal. And that was just how it was. And they sure that most of them, George never carried a gun that I could see, but if all his henchmen had bulges in their pockets, and some just had a gun hanging out of their belt, sort of thing. This is the early days of Georgia. You know, I guess there was police, but you know, I think cash and guns ruled. It's just, you know, just a function of a country coming out of suppression as it was from Russia. You know, it's
cash and guns ruled. I mean, you must have felt quite afraid, no? And especially there was one particular chap, wasn't there, Piotr or Peter, who you found particularly steely.
Yeah, they're all very nice to us because they wanted $1 million from us. And I don't know who knew what, how out of all the team, shall we say, but and maybe mistakenly, and I was a lot younger then, and you know, we were busy and we were, you know, answering questions from the shop in Sydney, and you know, as we're going, sort of thing. And yeah, I mean, I had this maybe somewhat mistaken thing that I had a sort of a gold $1 million halo over me that they were going to look after me. Anyway, it proved to be like that. But no, I mean, it was certainly just a bit disconcerting when you sit down to lunch and they just put their guns on the table like today someone put a mobile phone on the table. And but I remember saying I think it was to Potter one stage, you know, silly me, maybe I was trying to make conversation or something. I said, "Is that gun loaded?" And he looked at me. I thought, man, that was a dumb question.
Do you want to find out?
Yeah, what do they think they had in it? But anyway, but Potro particularly was very helpful when we were there. He spoke quite good English. He was Chechen, and I think Kevin had a few conversations with him. I think Kevin finds these sort of characters quite interesting, how they work. And I think Kevin said he thinks he was in the Chechen War, and he was a big, strong fellow. I mean, you wouldn't want to mix with him. But fortunately, we thought he was on our side, so we didn't have to.
So you had an initial meeting at the winery with the key people. Just very briefly, tell us about that meeting, and mainly your kind of your impressions afterwards. Yeah,
well, we went to the winery with Savannah No. 1 with George, and one of his henchmen was driving the car. And when we arrived, we thought, oh, it's great, we're going to get to see the wine. And first of all, we were ferried into the general manager's office, and handshakes, meeting, great, wonderful, nice to meet you. And George was there. And then they went on in a very long, rambling story about the winery in English, but mainly in Georgian. And it just went on. And I, sitting next to George, and I think one stage I looked at him and he just put his hand, just don't worry, just let them go. And what we came to realise in that meeting and a little bit later is that they wanted the winery to be reinstated. It was really old and decrepit. I mean, the bottling line, I'm sure, hadn't been used for many years. And they thought or were told that we were potential investors in their winery in Savannah No. 1, and they'd get it all going again, which, of course, we weren't there for that, for sure. We were obviously there for the Cellar, and we didn't know who knew what, but George certainly knew what we were there for. And so there became this, subtle jockeying going on of different agendas. But we went along with it because, we didn't have a choice. And we thought, this is the way things happen differently in different countries and different cultures. And so, we had to sit there and listen to this.
So they thought you were there to buy the winery. You were there to buy the cellar. George was somewhere in the middle pulling the strings. You must have been a bit concerned at this stage, to say the least.
Yeah, concerned, but I couldn't really establish who owned the wine. And even though I asked George that, he was a bit evasive on that one. But there's no doubt that George had authority there, because when these management of the cellar going on a bit too much. George would, pull it up and just sort of, he seemed to have some ability to control the meeting. And at one stage, I think he said, just let them talk their way out of it. They're elderly gentlemen, they'll get tired and then we can do what we want to do. And I went, well, okay. I mean, we were guests, so we'll go along with what's happening.
And then, after all the stalling and the endless talks, you did finally have a chance to see this mysterious cellar. Tell us about that moment and what your first impressions were.
Yeah, we actually didn't get to the level of the cellar where the old wines were until the next day. I think we went down, looked at some of their newer wines, and again, we were just going along with what was happening. And I think I might have put my foot down and said, George, we just travelled halfway around the world. If this is to happen, we want to see these wines. And the next day, this was a funny thing. The only person that had a key to the cellar was what we called the lady with the keys. I think we did know her name, but I can't remember what it was. And I can see this from the communist era, that, she was probably somehow had the keys to the cellar. And it was a bit of a hangover from those days. And she still had the keys to the cellar, and she might have had the only keys to the cellar. So the only way you get into the cellar is you have to wait for the lady with the keys to turn up, and she would unlock the door if she felt like it. Anyway, we got in the next day, and we went down to the cellar, and there was a whole team. I think a couple of George's henchmen were there. They came, and Kevin and I, George, general manager, and the winemaker. And so we're all winding down these spiral stairs, and the lady with the keys unlocked the level so we could get in and flick the switch. And when she flicked the switch, there's a couple of lights just on cords down the cellar, and they just sort of glowed. And you could see that there was just rows and rows and rows of bottles on racks, and really not much light. So, enough light, but so we had our fluoros with us and torches and that. And a lot of the racks were covered with cobwebs, but not all of them. And it was very wet. You could see, the walls were wet. There's water dripping, and which meant a lot of the labels were missing. Anyway, as you know, labels is not the main way to authenticate a bottle of wine. But so a lot of the labels were missing or partly missing. And so we're looking around, and Kevin typically was already, wandering along a row, looking almost smelling the wines. Because Kevin, people ask me, why did you take Kevin? Kevin is a fox. And I don't always use that word. Sometimes use a stronger word. But there's no doubt if there's a fox at play in this, Kevin would have smelt it straight away, because he's a little bit of a fox himself. So if there's anything untoward going on, his antennas would be up for sure. So he was wandering along looking. And then Mr. Ravaz, the chief winemaker, wandered along one row, and I was standing at the end. And the floor had a sort of a paved brick arrangement. And he wandered along there, and I didn't think anything of it, but my sixth sense was saying, don't know if he should be wandering along there, but I guess he's a chief winemaker, so maybe he can. But anyway, he leant over and took a bottle out of the racks. And I thought, that's interesting. And I happened to be on the same row. And he turned around and I was wandering back to us, and Mr. Ravaz wouldn't be terribly healthy, had a bit of an ambling gait. I'm sure he hadn't had any exercise for a long time. And as he was coming towards me, he moved the bottle from one hand to another, and being wet and slippery, it slipped out of his hand and just went. And I was fortunately not far from him. And as it landed, I quickly got my foot under it, and to break its fall, and I scooped up the bottle with my hand like a good slip salesman. And, of course, it was instinctive. It wasn't nothing else. Because really, when bottles land like that, they usually shatter and you end up with a handful of broken glass. But fortunately, I can only imagine it probably landed on its neck, and the neck snapped or something, and I caught the rest of it before it hit the ground. And so I had a bottle of wine in my hand, and I looked, and it was 1899 Chateau Sudereau. So it's a 100-year-old bottle of the great Sauterne Sudereau. So everyone sort of drew breath, and I stood there going, what am I doing? But, there you are. And this, of course, is one of the great serendipitous moments in our adventure. So suddenly I had this bottle that was 100 years old that was truly representative of the wines of the cellar. And in theory, we were going to get to taste it because it's now open, in effect. And I think Mr. Ravaz, chief winemaker, he went very red and skulked off somewhere, sort of thing. And I think Kevin thanked him and said, "Oh, thanks, Mr. Ravaz. Now we get to taste the wine." So we found some material, and we found a little jug and poured the wine through the material just in case there's any broken glass. And they had some glasses which they cleaned and wiped out very good, very well. And so we all had a taste of this wine. And this was a crucial moment, because if this wine wasn't superb, we're on the first plane out of there. So we all had this wine, and I remember smelling it at first, or looking at it, and it had that lovely old, and Sudereau. Sudereau is nothing like a Chem. A Chem's quite a robust wine. Sudereau is a much more elegant style of Sauterne, and I'd imported a number of vintages of Sudereau. I'd probably tasted maybe 20 or 30-year-old Sudereau, but nothing as old as this. But it had a fine golden colour to it. It hadn't gone dark brown or anything. So we had a smell, and of course immediately on the smell you got that lovely apricot-y, butterscotchy aromas from it, which I thought, well, this is pretty interesting. And then we all sipped it, and it had that lovely melange of butterscotch and nutty, and that slightly apricot-y character that comes from the botrytis, and it had a very fine bead of acidity, which to me meant the wine was quite alive, and it was just exceptional. It's just so ethereal in its presentation, and it was an exquisite wine, and probably where I'd accept Sudereau to go in 100 years. If it was a Chem, I'd think there's something wrong with it. It would be too light or too fine and too elegant, I think. So this wine was amazing, and I think, as I say in the book, the wine was brilliant, but the orchestra was deafening for this wine to be as good as it was. So that was a key moment.
So yeah, you tasted this delicious 100-year-old wine, which for you was a marker that this cellar was real. You'd just come down into this cellar, where you had thousands of bottles stretching away into the darkness, covered in cobwebs. What were your emotions at that moment? What were you feeling?
Gee, I don't think I've ever been asked that question. A certain amount of excitement, a certain amount that there's a chance that this is the real thing. I mean, this wine can't taste like this, and the other wine's not to be good. So, and also, as I said, I'm a bit single-minded. I stay very focused on what we're doing. Okay, this wine tastes good, I'm pleased. So where do we go from here? Rather than getting too excited and also, we were playing a bit of a poker hand. We were keeping our cards fairly close to our chest with the Georgians, because they actually didn't know what they had. And we were prepared to tell them. We'd tell them, in our way, and I guess when we wanted to. But no, we were really, I'd sort of been in this situation with certainly lesser wines in Australia, in cellars, and we had a job to do, and we kept our mind on the job.
And with that job, with a business hat on, even then, were you daring to dream? Because this cellar was going to cost you $1 million US, but you presumably had some sort of an idea what you might be able to sell it for.
Oh, well, in Australia, before we even left, I gave the cellar to Kevin. I said, Kevin, work this out, will you? As I would always do. And I think he did it when we were still in Australia. He valued it probably about $7 or $8 million worth. And the 217 bottles of a Chem, I think, represented $4 to $5 million. I mean, there are 3 bottles of 1847. And I think 1847s sell anything up to $200,000 a bottle. So there's 3 of those in the cellar. So we're on the right side of the ledger, shall we say. And also the question in all of this is, okay, these are great rare wines of considerable value, but what's the provenance worth? You know, they're wines that have gone, you could be almost certain they've gone from the chateau to St. Petersburg. So they've only had one fairing. They're probably laid there forever, and then they've gone to Tbilisi in Georgia. So their condition, the way they've been cellared and looked after would be impeccable. So, you know, and they're the wines of Nicholas II, of Stalin, of the Russian Revolution. You know, the provenance, I think, is extraordinary. But what's it worth? How would you know?
The wines of the Russian Revolution, shipped out by Stalin to evade the Nazis, including Ikem 1847, potentially $7 million of profit.
Yeah.
And it all seems to be checking out.
Yeah, and in the centre of it all, the unflappable John Baker. I did love his turn of phrase when he said, the wine was brilliant, but the orchestra was deafening. Possibly he's letting himself go a little bit there.
Glorious, glorious. Anyway, so we're going to end this part here. It's a long episode already. If you want to listen to the next and concluding part of the story right now, sign up to Wine Blast Plus at wineblast.co.uk or click the link on our show notes.
You definitely don't want to miss it. Meantime, thanks to John Baker. The book is Stalin's Wine Cellar, published by Penguin. We'll see you for the next instalment. So until next time, thanks for listening and cheers.